Bonjour tout le monde. Donc, je voudrais vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cette présentation sur le fédéralisme dans le cadre de l'axe de recherche sur le fédéralisme du Centre d'études en gouvernance de l'Université d'Ottawa. Mon nom est André Lecourt. Je suis aussi professeur à l'École d'études politiques ici à l'Université d'Ottawa. Et nous aurons aujourd'hui une présentation du professeur Fenna de l'Université Curtin en Australie. So today I'm happy to welcome you to this presentation by Fenna from Curtin University. This is a presentation that is held under the umbrella of the Center on Governance at the University of Ottawa, and more specifically, its Federalism Research Axis, which I lead. Avant de vous présenter notre conférencier d'aujourd'hui, laissez-moi vous faire quelques annonces. Tout d'abord, c'est la première conférence que nous avons aujourd'hui d'un cycle de conférences qui se produira pendant l'année scolaire 2021-2022. C'est aussi la première conférence, évidemment, de l'axe de recherche sur le fédéralisme. C'est un axe qui examine plusieurs dimensions différentes du fédéralisme, incluant la dimension qui sera en vedette aujourd'hui, le fédéralisme fiscal, mais aussi des questions de gestion de la diversité, d'arrangements institutionnels et de relations intergouvernementales. La deuxième conférence sous cet axe de recherche sur le fédéralisme aura lieu le 4 novembre à midi. Il s'agira d'une conférence au sujet d'un nouveau livre de Félix Mathieu et d'Evelyne Brie. Donc, les deux auteurs nous présenteront leur volume intitulé « Un pays divisé, identité, fédéralisme et régionalisme au Canada ». Donc, on vous y invite. On vous invite aussi à la prochaine conférence, sous un axe différent, mais la prochaine conférence du Centre, qui aura lieu le 14 octobre de 9h à 3h et qui s'intitule « Enjeux de la gouvernance multiniveau dans la protection, la gestion et le droit de l'eau douce ». So just to briefly summarize what I just said in French, this is the first kind of conference for this academic year for the Center on Governance. The next conference of the Center will be held on October 14th, and it will be on multi-level governance issues in freshwater protection management and law. And the next conference of the Federalism Research Axis, which looks at questions of fiscal federalism, diversity management, institutional arrangements, and intergovernmental relations, will be, and that one will be in French on November 4th. It will be around a new book by Félix Mathieu and Evelyne Brie, a book entitled « Un pays divisé, identité, fédéralisme et régionalisme au Canada ». It's a very interesting book based on analysis of survey data, the Confederation of Tomorrow survey data. Donc, avant de présenter le professeur Fenna, je voudrais vous encourager, pour ceux qui ne l'ont pas fait encore, à s'abonner au bulletin du Centre d'études en gouvernance. I'd like to encourage everybody to give their name for receiving the newsletter of the Center on Governance. And now I'll introduce our speaker. So the background for Professor Fenna's conference today, in a sense, is the big Fiscal Federalism in Canada conference that we held last April, where we discussed various issues related to fiscal federalism in Canada. At this point, we thought it would be appropriate to add a presentation from a comparative perspective. And that's what Professor Fenna will do for us today. So Fenna is a professor at Curtin University in Australia, in Western Australia. Although Australian, he has lived and studied in Canada. So he knows Canadian federalism and fiscal federalism very well. He's therefore in a good position to contrast it and compare it to Australia and also many other federations. Professor Fenna is the co-author of, I think it's fair to say, now a classic book called Comparative Federalism, a Systematic Inquiry which compares multiple federations on the basis of multiple issues and dynamics. So Professor Fenna will speak for about 25 minutes, and then feel free to ask questions in the Q&A section. And after Professor Fenna is done with his presentation, then I'll just relay your questions to him. So Alan, welcome to virtually, of course, but the University of Ottawa and its Center on Governance. And now we're all ears. So over to you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Andre, and the rest of the team at the Centre. Good morning to all of the rest of you who have kindly got involved, or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. Here it's evening. So I've been tasked with putting Canadian fiscal federalism in a comparative perspective or comparative context, which I shall do by looking at it in the two main dimensions. First of all, the operation of fiscal federalism on the vertical plane, which I'll put under the heading of vertical fiscal imbalance. And secondly, the operation of fiscal relations on the horizontal plane, or horizontal fiscal equalization, or just equalization in short. Don't worry, I'm not going to try and cover all aspects of fiscal federalism in the time that I've got allotted. Given that focusing on those two, I'll pose two questions in respect of them in turn. The first one is, to what extent does Canadian federalism represent some sort of best practice, as was once alleged by Robin Baudouin? Now, this notion is probably, first of all, measured against an abstract set of principles from the literature, but it's also implicitly a suggestion that Canada, relative to other federations, is a shining example. And the second question I want to pose vis-a-vis these two aspects of fiscal federalism is, what explains the degree of conflict? If things are so good, in other words, why are they so bad? But before plunging into these questions, it might help to say a few things of a preliminary nature about why and how we are comparing here, and neither of these are straightforward. In his presidential address to the CPSA a few years ago, Alain Noël eloquently put the case that we don't need to compare, we don't need to bother comparing. And his point is well taken. So here I suggest we want to compare for two reasons. One is to put Canadian practices in a perspective that allows us to see what's distinctive and what gives us some sort of benchmarks and sense of possibilities. And the second is that potentially a comparison allows us, or provides some assistance in explaining certain aspects of the system. Now, neither of these are guaranteed to work by any stretch of the imagination, but they do give us a launching point. So first of all, next, given that it seems reasonable to try and compare, is it possible to do so? And again, this is not very straightforward either. The first challenge here is simply too few cases. So what I've done is assemble the usual suspects that provide some semblance of a most similar comparison: Canada, Australia, the United States, Switzerland, Germany. And the second challenge here is that even with such a limited range of ostensibly most similar cases, there's too much difference between them. And just to indicate some of those differences on the political level, in terms of political system, for instance, Germany's integrated federalism is so profoundly different from that in Canada, Australia, the United States, that it makes it very difficult to compare. And there's probably not much payoff in comparing Germany with Canada in many ways. Switzerland's direct democracy and its profound role in the Swiss political system make Switzerland quite distinctive and difficult to compare. And of course, both of those countries use their constitutions in a much more active way to regulate fiscal relationships than we find in the other three federations. On a societal level, there's of course a very obvious difference that stands out, and that is Canada's bi-communal nature. None of these other federations in this sample are multinational, binational, bi-communal. So Canada is unique in this respect, and it's consequently distinctive in the way it has experienced less centralisation or resisted the pressure for centralisation more so than in the other established federations. At the political economy level, perhaps there's a little bit more hope, and we could point here, for instance, to some similarities between Canada and Australia. For instance, if we divide up the constituent units, we can see there's a roughly similar pattern between the first, or the core of the demographic and politically, economically dominant metropolitan jurisdictions, home to most manufacturing, the existence of some resource-dependent jurisdictions, and some jurisdictions who are rather luckless in both respects. By happy coincidence, I'm able to say a few things about the Australian case. So hopefully that comparison is useful. So let's start with the vertical plane, as I said at the beginning. It's an axiom of the field that finance should follow function. In other words, jurisdictions should have fiscal capacity commensurate with or proportional to their responsibilities, their expenditure responsibilities. And of course, it's also well acknowledged in the literature that this is much easier said than done. Local provision is more logical and exists much more widely than local revenue raising. And the result is endemic vertical fiscal imbalance. Now note here that while it seems to be a fashion in Canada to distinguish between something called vertical fiscal gap and vertical fiscal imbalance, I can't see the distinction is either necessary or workable. So I'll stick to the more straightforward notion as we use it here in Australia, where VFI is simply the situation where one order of government has revenue in excess of its spending responsibilities, while the other has responsibilities in excess of its own source revenue. Now, I said VFI is endemic, and other than, in effect, the radical alternative, which is a system of joint taxation, such as is characteristic of the German system. But here, to come back to an earlier point, Germany's system of integrated federalism, with the states enjoying co-determination rights via the Bundesrat, is the key to making such an arrangement work. So, to what extent do the constituent units in Canada and the other federations have financial self-sufficiency? So the starting point I'll take for this is the share of tax revenue raised by constituent units and their local governments. According to 2020 OECD figures, Canada does pretty well here. So according to these figures, at least, we must always be mindful and treat these as stylized facts, I think, in general. That Canada sits at 54% of revenue raised by constituent units and local governments, Switzerland at 53%, the United States at 47.7%, and Australia at 19.5%. Now, Australia is clearly the outlier here, and it reflects the success of the Commonwealth government, the federal government, in appropriating exclusive access to the three main revenue bases. And that goes well back early in the 20th century. Canadian provinces and US states, of course, can and most do levy their own income and sales taxes, by contrast with Australia. However, in both countries, with the income tax, they are definitely the junior partner in that relationship. By contrast, the most federal of all the states, of all the cases in this sample, in many ways, Switzerland, the cantons are the senior partner when it comes to income taxation. They do all the revenue raising in that respect, share some of it with the federal government. But that also carries with it its accompanying risk, as the literature would predict, of potentially harmful or perverse tax competition, which is mitigated to some extent in the Swiss situation by a fairly high degree of effective horizontal intergovernmentalism. So all that's well and good, but the real question is the extent to which the constituent units have their own source revenue commensurate with their spending responsibilities. And here again, Canada looks pretty good on the list. More balanced certainly than the two Anglo federations. Again, these somewhat stylized figures, but Canada, with the constituent units relying on transfers for 20% of their funding. The United States constituents are 33%, Australia 42%. And here the standout is Switzerland, which relies only 13% on transfers from the federal government. So Canada looks pretty good on that list, but it's not quite in the same league as Switzerland. Now, there are two risks with vertical fiscal imbalance: the quantum and the conditions. So as far as the quantum is concerned, we know that in Canada, all intergovernmental transfers from the federal government are at the sole discretion of that government and part of the federal government's budgetary process. Obvious risk here that any time the federal government could decide it doesn't have the usual amount of funds to spare, it could change the quantum. Not, of course, that such a treacherous action would ever be taken. One best practice example, oddly enough, here comes from Australia, where half the Commonwealth's transfers to the states, and remember, that's a lot of money in Australia, the Australian case, come in the form of the entire net proceeds of the GST, the goods and services tax, with an entirely unconditional transfer, as per a formal intergovernmental agreement and a Commonwealth legislation. So it is not difficult to see why the arrangement with the Australian GST, as I said, all of whose net proceeds go to the states, caught the eye of Quebec's Séguin Commission in 2002. That Australian arrangement had just been introduced at the time that the Séguin Commission was writing, but remains in operation as originally formed, unchanged. While though it guarantees a very large chunk of money, there remains ample room, nonetheless, it has to be said, for diminution in the supply of the other funds that the Commonwealth sends to the states, which are substantial as well, the specific purpose payments. And even more so than the representing best practice than the Australian arrangement with the GST is the Swiss arrangement, where not only do the cantons enjoy primacy in income tax collection, but this is stipulated in the Constitution itself, as is their share of whatever falls to the federal government. So, enough about the quantum. What about the conditions, the spending power? Now, the federalism literature acknowledges a legitimate role for directive spending by central governments to address various issues of spillovers and undersupply. However, there's always the risk of coercive or opportunistic use of the spending power. The temptation is hard to resist for central governments for various reasons, partly programmatic ambitions of the party in power at the time, partly electoral anxiety about getting the blame for raising taxes and not the credit for supplying services, and often even electorate or riding by riding electoral pragmatism that leads to those kind of overstepping of the lines. There's a core similarity here between Australia, Canada, and the United States, in that the largest transfer is to mandate systems of public health insurance. Beyond that, however, transfers are clearly much more benign, and the spending power is used much more modestly in Canada than either the US or Australia. Australia is not quite the unitary state that the Séguin Commission described it as, but it is certainly much more centralized than Canada. And there's a nice passage from a recent Commonwealth budget papers that doesn't, or unabashedly acknowledges these realities. And if you don't mind, I'll read that to you. The Commonwealth provides payments to the states for specific purposes in policy areas for which the states have primary responsibility. These payments cover most areas of state and local government activity, including health, education, skill and workforce development, community services, housing, Indigenous affairs, infrastructure, and environment. So the Commonwealth government is not shy in acknowledging the extent to which it interferes in areas of state primacy, as it calls it. And moreover, in neither Australia nor the United States is there the possibility of opting out with financial compensation from national programs. In Australia, all this is backed up by the fact that the spending power enjoys explicit constitutional support. Section 96 declares unequivocally, and I quote, "Parliament may grant financial assistance to any state on the terms and conditions as the Parliament thinks fit." Now, neither the US nor the Canadian Constitution contain anything like that. However, it would be a very bold domestic court that would try and tell Parliament how it may or may not spend its money. And the US Supreme Court certainly gave up that idea a long time ago. Okay, so enough about VFI for now. Let's turn to the horizontal plane, equalization. Two questions here: how much and how? So first of all, how much? Equalization has been described, again, I think by Robin Bodway, as the lifeblood of federations. However, the reality is that federations vary quite significantly in how much blood they need. US and Germany are at one extreme, and Australia and Germany at one extreme, the US is at the other, where there is no formal equalization system at all. Now, if we look at the ratio of the highest to lowest fiscal capacity in 2012, according to the OECD, before and after equalization, at the top of the list is Australia, where a ratio of 7.5 times before equalization and 1 after equalization. In other words, a complete equalization. Germany, 1.7 before, 1.1 after equalization. So essentially similar in a thoroughgoing equalization to the Australian case. Canada, 2.4 before and 1.8 afterwards. And Switzerland, 4.3 before and 2.6 afterwards. So there's a big difference between the partial equalizers, Canada and Switzerland, and the thoroughgoing equalizers, Australia and Germany. So if that's how much, how about how? And here it is generally broken down into a distinction between whether the transfer occurs directly or indirectly, sometimes referred to as horizontal or vertical, though they're both horizontal, which is a bit confusing. But is it directly horizontal from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, or is it via the central government, a payment down from the central government? Canada's system is entirely indirect or top-down from out of the federal government budget. Germany, by contrast, has long used or relied extensively on direct transfer from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, what the Germans call fraternal equalization, and have added an indirect element, so combine both styles. Switzerland similarly uses elements of both. The interesting case is Australia here, where the existing system could be described in either of those terms. It is indirect in that it's a transfer from the Commonwealth to the states, but it's direct in that it is a transfer within an existing predetermined pool of state funds, which then gets allocated according to an equalization formula. I think we can surmise that with equalization, first of all, direct transfer is conducive to full equalization, while indirect tends towards partial equalization. And secondly, that indirect should provoke less political conflict because it's less obviously robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's not as in your face, as it were. However, at the same time, it's not that difficult to see that Peter is being robbed to pay Paul, even in an indirect system. And of course, what is intuitively evident can easily be demonstrated quantitatively that by those who have a self-interest in doing so, who want to do the maths on where federal revenues are drawn or disproportionately raised. And of course, for instance, in the Canadian case, Ontario and Alberta have both engaged in that exercise. So let me just pause here for a quick stock take of all of that. In a nutshell, then, Canada might be seen as having best practice fiscal federalism in that there is a low degree of VFI, reasonably balanced and coordinated access to main tax bases, a moderate exercise of the spending power, a reasonable degree of equalization, and no inflammatory direct transfer from contributor to beneficiary jurisdictions. On the other hand, there nonetheless remains substantial VFI. There are no arrangements to reduce the scope for unilateralism and transfer quanta, and the equalization system is clearly unstable. I began by saying that Canada might be seen as having best practice fiscal federalism, and that will undoubtedly look different depending on where one sits. For instance, the federal government may look from our side like it's very restrained in the use of spending power, and much of Canada may share that view. However, Quebec is unlikely to. Western Australians can only fantasize about keeping their windfall gains to anything like the extent Alberta does, is another example of how it looks different from different perspectives. That Alberta does manage to keep a lot of its windfall gains may well seem to anyone else like a dereliction of equalization duty. So it's very much a question of judgment. Now, I want to finish up this presentation by looking at the conflict side of the issues. As I said before, if things are so good, why are they so bad? Why is there so much conflict? Now, while judging the amount of conflict is not entirely straightforward or far from it, according to Bailon and Lecour, two leading Canadian authorities on the subject, there is enough that it calls for explanation. I will suggest that while the explanations for conflict of a VFI and HFE are rather different, in both cases, the answer is in no small part Quebec. So looking first at the vertical dimension, VFI and the spending power, there's no doubt that conflict on the vertical plane has been greater in Canada than in either Australia or the United States, where these are largely settled issues. Here, Bailon and Lecour are surely correct to highlight the centrifugal impact of Quebec on Canadian federalism. And between them, the Tremblay and Séguin reports made very clear that Quebec has a decidedly more autonomous conception of fiscal federalism than the rest of Canada, as François Cochet and others have emphasized. The spending power exercised in even the most benign way is an affront to that conception, and for simple population reasons, Quebec holds sufficient political leverage to alter the entire tenor of federalism in Canada. At the same time, though, we must acknowledge the effect of contingent or adventitious factors. If the savage cuts to transfers of 1996 had not been made in Canada, the picture would look very different. Now here, recall that by 1984, the Canadian government had managed to dig itself into an extraordinary fiscal hole, running a deficit of 8% of gross domestic product. That deficit was still 5% by the late 1980s. In Australia, by contrast, the Commonwealth had restored the budget to surplus by the late 1980s, and while deficits returned after the 1990 recession, drastic reductions in transfers were not required. So had simply things been slightly different historically in Canada, then the degree of conflict that the 1996 cuts provoked would never have occurred, and we wouldn't have to explain it. On the horizontal plane, equalization, and if one wanted evidence here of conflict in Canada, Alberta's scheduled plebiscite on whether Section 36(2) of the Constitution Act should be removed would surely be enough. Of course, it's not because of Section 36(2) that Canada has equalization. Rather, it has Section 32 because of its commitment to equalization, but the political point is clear. There are actually two things that need explaining here, I think. One is the degree of conflict, and the other is the degree of instability and recalibration that occurs. And I'll come back to the argument of Bailon and Lecour, there are several reasons for the heightened degree of conflict over equalization, but the one on which they place the most emphasis is Canada's failure to be sufficiently Australian. And I'll quote them here. The first and most important cause is the governance structure, the Australian model of governance for equalization, characterized by the existence since 1933 of an arm's-length federal commission that makes recommendations on relativities. Yes, indeed. Since 1933, Australia has had the Commonwealth Grants Commission, a federal government agency, calculating how much each jurisdiction should receive. And yes, there's been much less conflict over equalisation than in Canada for much of this period. Whether there is any relationship, though, between these two facts is difficult to determine. It would certainly be nice if there was a convenient little fix like that, where Canada could import something along the lines of the Commonwealth Grants Commission, and then perhaps some kudos to us inventive Australians. However, in particular, one must be mindful of the fundamental underlying differences between the two countries here. For almost the entire history of the Australian equalisation system, the two demographically and economically dominant jurisdictions have been the funders. Neither New South Wales nor Victoria, with between them 60% of the Australian population, has ever been a recipient of equalisation. This meant manageably low per capita costs for the contributor states. Contrast Canada here, where Quebec, counterpart to the Australian state of Victoria, has been a recipient for the entire history of the equalisation system. At the outset, it consumed fully 1/3 of the pool, and that has risen to the point where it consumes more than all other provinces combined. Germany's largest state, North Rhine-Westphalia, is also a beneficiary, but only absorbs 10% of the total equalisation transfers in that country. So the moral of the story there would seem to be that the underlying realities are that create a situation that is far more complicated in Canada than in Australia. Now, what happened in Australia is that everything changed 15 years ago. In virtually overnight, Western Australia's iron ore royalties went from $300 million a year to $6 billion a year. And that threw the entire equalisation into the system in Australia into exactly the same sort of difficulty. Well, not exactly, but very similar difficulties to Canada. And increased or introduced a level of conflict that had not existed before. And so in effect, we are not needing to explain a contrast between one system with great conflict and another without. What it is a period of relative accord in Australia until Australia developed a situation very similar to Canada's with Alberta. So that led to Western Australia's share of the GST pool plunging from 100% of an equal per capita share to 30% of its per capita share, and its protests rising accordingly. 2 inquiries later, and a great deal of political conflict and campaigning, and the Commonwealth government conceded and changed the rules to put a floor under the relativities such that Western Australia wouldn't be punished to that extent. Of course, it was a rather perverse move because just a few weeks ago, the government of Western Australia announced the largest budget surplus in its history and the second largest of any state in Australian history, just as, of course, the eastern states are struggling with the fiscal consequences of COVID-19, which illustrated how completely unnecessary such a move was, but the political pressure was sufficient that it forced the Commonwealth government to do that. So in the end, it was the case that it is these structural features, I would say, that really explain the main differences between the Canada and Australia in terms of level of conflict over HFE, and that they are not particularly amenable to any easy solution. So, as a takeaway message from all of this, there's a few. One of them is that Canada is certainly the obvious one. Canada is certainly closer to best practice fiscal federalism than the United States or Australia. The second is the importance of asymmetry when there are divergent interpretations or cultures around the extent to which VFI is legitimate and the use of the spending power is legitimate. A third is that in some ways Switzerland offers a superior model of best practice fiscal federalism in certain aspects I've touched on. And fourthly, or finally, is that Canada is in a much trickier situation as far as fiscal equalization than virtually any other federation, and that there is no easy solution to those. And in the end, I'd say that, as I said early on, that Quebec is clearly a big part of the explanation. It's a very big part of the explanation why Canada has best practice to the extent it does. But it's also a big part of the explanation as to why there's so much problem with fiscal equalization. As I said, Australia would look very different if Victoria had been a recipient or beneficiary for the entire period of equalization in Australia. But of course, it's only part of the answer to that complex situation in Canada. We might also add the fact that Alberta has the misfortune of producing a resource, much of which for a long time was consumed locally, and hence its profits were off the backs of Canadians, whereas all of Western Australia's resources are directly exported overseas. So I will wrap it up there. Clearly, there's, in many of these things I've passed over them very quickly, there's much more we could dig into if we want to.
All right, Alan, thank you very much. We'll now go ahead with our question and answer period. So if you have a question for Alan, please use the Q&A section of Zoom rather than the chat section, which you won't be able to use. You can read some of our general announcements in it, but for the Q&A, we'll use a specific question and answer function. So Alan, first question on the vertical transfers and the Australian intergovernmental agreement that frames it, which, as you said, is a contrast to Canada, where the federal government really has, retained more discretion over these these transfers. It's a little bit of a surprising, a counterintuitive outcome, I think, that in Australia you have the Commonwealth government putting some self-constraint, whereas in Canada, the more decentralized, federation, you have the federal government keeping its almost total discretion on transfers. So what was the dynamics or the context, perhaps, for the outcome in Australia?
As you say, it is counterintuitive, and it's not what you would expect from the Australian case, which is why particularly one of the reasons why I mentioned it. And there are two reasons, I think, why it did happen and could happen. The first is it's one of those accidents of political moments. The federal government wanted to introduce a goods and services tax, which we didn't have in Australia. And if you recall the cost of introducing that, what that was into the federal government in Canada earlier on, it's a risky political gamble. And one way to make it much safer for the federal government politically was to get all the states lined up on side endorsing the move to introduce the GST, because they would be receiving the revenue. Now, in some ways, it was a fiscal illusion because they were already receiving that money, but it was, like the Canadian arrangement, just a annual budgetary allocation from the Commonwealth government. They were called FAGs, financial assistance grants. And so the net cost to the federal government wasn't any greater. It didn't lose any particular revenue source, but it looked like it was a major gain for the states. The states endorsed it. It made it much easier to introduce the GST. Even then, it was, of course, electorally costly to do so, but they got away with it. And so that was, the agreement was signed in 1999. The GST was introduced in 2000. And it was reinforced by the fact that this was backed up with Commonwealth legislation about the states, about all net revenue being dispersed to the states. And in the Australian system, where we have strong bicameralism and the federal government rarely ever has a majority in the Senate, being in legislation is a stronger guarantee, much stronger guarantee than it would be in Canada, for instance. And the second reason I think why it can have happened, despite the high level of centralisation in Australia, is that there's still plenty of room to play in the amount that's allocated through the specific purpose payments. So there's plenty of room for the Commonwealth to exercise control with its specific purpose payments, and plenty of room to adjust how much it transfers. So it wasn't tying the Commonwealth's hands as much as it might have been. So, does that answer your question, Andre?
It does, but there's a follow-up, Alan.
Okay.
And it's basically, I'll read it. Do you think the Commonwealth will continue such restraint in the future? And what are the various parties indicating on this issue? Are there some kind of, partisan differences on transfers?
No, I would say it's essentially a settled issue. It's not an issue over which there is political debate, unlike equalization. And I mean, the Labor Party had introduced most of the specific purpose programs in the first place because it had much greater ambitions in terms of national programs. But both sides of politics are happy to make use of it and use it to align it, use it as a tool to align state policy with their ideological preoccupations. So there's no particular partisan divide on the issue. And of course, Australia doesn't have a regionalised party system. So it's not it's not as if there's any part of the country that's going to particularly object. And as I said, because it's relatively painless, the current arrangements are relatively painless to the Commonwealth government, it's likely to stay that way. And the disappointing thing for the states is that one of the advantages they saw in getting the GST revenue is that it would naturally increase with the growth of the economy, but it doesn't increase at the same rate as the income tax does, and the states have no access to the income tax.
All right, thank you. I'll put a couple of questions together here because it's on the same topic, which is the Alberta referendum on equalization. And one of the attendees notes that, one of the things that comes out of your presentation, I think, again, it's always a good point to stress, is the highly political nature of transfers, right? So we have a couple of questions here in relation to the referendum in Alberta. One question, I'll read it the way it's framed, is, do you think it's a, air quotes good or air quotes bad move for Alberta to hold this referendum? Another question, someone else asked you, have you heard of similar initiatives, perhaps in Switzerland, because of course it's a federation known for direct democracy, but regardless of that, what is your, I guess, comparative take and maybe Australian take on the forthcoming Alberta referendum on equalization?
Well, the Swiss managed to pull off a major reform of their equalization program about 15 years ago. And part of the reason they were able to get away with that is because Switzerland has several more cantons than either Australia or Canada have jurisdictions, and it's easier to build coalitions and have cross-cutting cleavages and so on to neutralize opposition. And partly because of which particular cantons would end up benefiting and not. So it never resulted in a situation that, and also partly, of course, because it combined vertical and horizontal payments, and because it was only a partial equalizer, it is only a partial equalization. So the various reasons why the Swiss managed to finesse that very nicely, and I think it's generally regarded as being quite a successful set of compromises and a reform to the system. And I'm not aware of something similar to the Alberta move. And of course, as you would know, Andre, it does evoke thoughts of 1933 in Western Australia, when there was a referendum held to secede from the Federation, which was much more enthusiastically supported by Western Australians than anything equivalent in Quebec was supported by Quebecers. So, I mean, that's the only analogy I can think of in the Australian case, and that gave rise to the Commonwealth Grants Commission. But it seems like those are the sort of political strategies that backfire in the end, I would have thought, in this context.
So if I'm hearing you, I'm hearing bad move on the part of the Alberta government.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing?
From an Australian perspective, it just seems quite astonishing because as I said in my presentation, Western Australians would dream of being able to keep the percentage of their windfall earnings from royalties that Alberta gets to keep on a regular basis. From a Western Australian point of view, they have absolutely nothing to complain about. It's astonishing to get away with it from a Western Australian point of view. But everything is relative to the particular country you're in, the culture you're in, and the political economy of that country, and so on. So.
We're waiting for an article from you in the Calgary Herald saying this very thing, right? Okay, Alan, next question, something a little bit different. Can you speak to Australia and maybe some other cases in relation to Canada in terms of the incentives that are built in for the constituent units to exercise fiscal discipline?
Well, one of the things I've deliberately left out, not to make this talk too long, and there's considerable variation across these federations in those regards, particularly when we contrast essentially the Australian, US, Canada side with Germany, where fiscal discipline had to be imposed on the lender. But by and large, it would seem that a system of self-responsibility or autonomy and market discipline has been pretty successful in all these in those three federations in running the show as far as borrowing limits and fiscal responsibility are concerned. But I don't want to get into the whole discussion about whether there's soft and hard constraints and so on. But.
Thank you. So one attendee says, okay, your talk has focused more on kind of the richer and more populous constituent units, but can you speak a little bit to the situation of the poor constituent units in these federations? Including in the American context, of course, where there's no horizontal fiscal equalization, which presumably would exacerbate the consequences of economic territorial disparities and aggravating inequalities and poor public services. And so basically the question is, can you speak to the situation of the poor and less populous constituent units in these federations?
Well, to some extent, I think I have implicitly in that two things. One is that those are the jurisdictions that tend to benefit and be happy to accept vertical assistance in terms of the use of the spending power and don't quibble with vertical fiscal imbalance. It works to their advantage. And secondly, they are obviously the jurisdictions that in Canada and Australia and the European federations are well looked after by equalization, though much by not quite so well looked after in Canada as they are in Australia or Germany, obviously. So it does create a very different perspective on both questions, the question of VFI, which becomes more or less a matter of indifference for those jurisdictions, and the question of equalization, where they have a very strong vested interest. But I'm not sure, is there a specific question in there?
No, I think it was broadly framed, so I think that's good. Thank you.
Okay.
I have a question on Switzerland. The question, I'll read this one. So Switzerland has German, it's German-speaking, French-speaking, Italian-speaking regions. Do you think that Canada's bilingualism has a distinct or different impact on fiscal federalism than that kind of Switzerland's multilingualism?
Completely different, yes. And I said at the outset, I think Canada is the only genuinely bi-communal federation in that group. Switzerland may have two main languages, but it doesn't have that sense of bi-communalism, particularly because there's significant cross-cutting other cleavages that break up any potential lines of conflict as well. So, and I think that comes through in a number of recent studies, in particular, that Canada's genuinely distinctive in that respect, and it has a genuinely distinctive effect on fiscal federalism.
Thank you. And also, one of the things that you've said before, and this is more in relation to Switzerland, is the fact that there is in relation to Australia, is that there's Quebec, but there's also, I think your argument is more territorial diversity in Canada and Australia, right? I mean, you have this quotation that I like, that I've cited a couple of times. Australia does not have the good fortune of having a Quebec, but it also does not have some of the other regional diversity that help keep the Canadian Federation much more decentralized. I think that holds for the fiscal field as well, right?
It does, and I was thinking about that because I'm rather fond of that line myself as well. But it did strike me that there's also the fact that maybe even in the context of other diversities in Canada, particularly a more diverse political economy than Australia, and I can elaborate on that if you want me to, that even there, for instance, it's well known that Alberta has managed to use the leverage provided by Quebec to get benefits for itself. And so to some extent, not only is Quebec a major factor on its own, but its presence has reinforced other centrifugal tendencies. So it's pretty fundamental to the whole equation, I think.
In this context here, I have another question asking you, do you think it might be, fruitful to, in your comparison, to look at states that are not formally federations, but that maybe, certainly with respect to Canada, maybe are closer to Canada, because they're plurinational, multinational. So Spain and the United Kingdom. So from a fiscal perspective, maybe is there a better basis for comparison with Canada, even though these aren't formally federations?
Well, I wouldn't put Spain and the United Kingdom in the same sentence there. I would certainly think that there's value in looking at Spain, in part because not only is it like Canada in having genuine multinational characteristics, multi-nation characteristics, but it is in many ways, for all intents and purposes, indeed a federation as well. So that's, I think there's no question that's, and had I done my homework properly, I should have included it in my analysis.
So our next question is on municipal governments. Has the Commonwealth government in Australia become more involved in financing local governments over the last few years, in particular with respect to infrastructure? If so, does that create tension with state governments? Do local governments demand more direct central government funding?
The situation of local governments is very different in Australia from most other countries. main cities in each state are often essentially synonymous with that state, certainly in Western Australia, where most people live in the main city. And it's the same goes for Sydney or Melbourne. So it's very hard to speak of local government issues as being somehow separate from state government issues. And all the major infrastructure decisions and policymaking are state decisions, not local government decisions. So Commonwealth increased funding for infrastructure is a relationship between the Commonwealth and the respective state governments, not with local governments. So the same kind of tension doesn't really arise. There have been, since the early 1970s, backdoor funding of local governments in Australia by the Commonwealth, which has caused some issues for and undermined to some extent Australian federalism. But that's quite separate from the increase recently in investment in major infrastructure projects. And that's very much, as I say, between the Commonwealth government and the respective state governments. So for instance, Melbourne, a few years ago, there was a plan for a major arterial freeway. And the Labor government vetoed that in favour of public transport and had to push back significantly on the Commonwealth's demand to fund it because there was an ideological divide of this issue, but it was entirely between the state government's decision to forego the Commonwealth funds and go ahead to terminate the freeway project and go ahead with increased funding for public transport. This whole situation is reinforced by the fact that all Australian cities that are made up of multiple local governments. There is no local, the Melbourne government is just the CBD. The Sydney government is just the CBD. The Central Business District. Yeah. So it's a very different situation.
Okay. Thanks, Alan. Interesting question on programs of fiscal stabilization. So Canada has a program of fiscal stabilization, which basically provides some kind of an insurance to provinces that experience a sudden and important drop in revenue, so in time. It's been criticized here by the Alberta government, essentially as being inadequate. Can you speak to that? Maybe does something comparable exist in Australia and other federations? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, even though I don't really have an answer, because I don't think there is something quite comparable. There's certainly nothing comparable here. And my first response to that would be, it's probably not necessary in the Australian situation, given the thoroughness of the equalisation system. If you have thoroughgoing equalisation, as Australia does, then you don't really need a backup plan of that nature. The only issue, and this exacerbated problems with Western Australia a few years ago, is the fact that equalisation is calculated on a rolling 3-year average. So by the time you get more, the extra revenues come a little bit further down the track. But by and large, it's not necessary in the context of complete equalisation like as Australia operates in. So it seems to me like a Canadian peculiarity.
But what would happen, Alan, if Western Australia had a sudden, sharp, and considerable drop in revenue? It may be that it wouldn't that wouldn't be compensated by equalization, right?
Well, it would be, but not immediately.
That's it. Right.
Yeah. So we just have to live with it until then.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to read another question to you here. Governments in Canada are in deficit year after years of cutting taxes in better economic times. Do you see the Australian model of GST could hold potential for increasing federal revenue with support from provinces and territories? So I think the idea is, well, what do you think of the Australian model of using the GST for Canada?
Well, if that's the question, though, I didn't understand that was quite the question that was being asked there.
Okay.
But
we'll answer both, then, mine and that one.
I must say, I do think the Australian model makes a lot of sense, and I think it's, as I said, it wasn't surprising that the Sagan Commission was attracted by that notion, to have a broad national VAT that is channeled direct, that is distributed among the jurisdictions. So you get the efficiency of a national system, you get the redistributive elements, and you get VFI addressed to a considerable extent. So there's certainly a lot to be said for it, I think.
Thank you. I'm reading another question here. Given that Australia has exercised a robust public sector reform since the beginning of the 2000s, how does that impacted fiscal federalism, public sector reform in Australia? Or has it?
Just trying to think. I don't think it has. I don't think there's been an impact on fiscal federalism. I mean, unless there's maybe the person asking the question has something specific in mind, but I can't think what that might have been. Insofar as there's been public sector reform, which has been going on since the 80s, it's been at both levels of government and, or sorry, both orders of government, as you like to say in Canada, and hasn't really affected their relationship to each other, I don't think.
Okay, thank you. Can you speak a little bit to the effect of decentralization for other levels of government that are not formally constituent units, right? The idea here is that one could argue that in Canada the autonomy of the provinces presents a problem for municipal governments. Any thoughts on that type of relationship?
I don't see why it has to. And perhaps, again, one aspect there is revenue deficiency. The level of government with the most surplus money is the one who can play the most, the role as benefactor to local government. But I think it's a tricky question, and I don't really have an answer to that, I'm afraid. As I said, the Australian experience is context is so different. And I think the Canadian one's is more difficult. And I don't feel I have the expertise to comment on that.
Okay, thank you. Just a follow-up question to one we had earlier on about kind of the situation of poor constituent units and federations. I guess, a more specific question is the stability of federations more threatened by, I guess, wealthier constituent units who resent, transfers, or by kind of poorer constituent units who are dissatisfied, right? What does kind of the comparative politics of federations tell us about that?
Well, I think it tells us that the disadvantaged jurisdictions are in a lose-lose situation. That they are, if they're not happy with the status quo, they might be losing from that. But what's their alternative? It's only the wealthy jurisdictions that have a perception and perhaps a reality of having a genuine alternative. Historically, it was different, say, in Western Australia when Western Australians voted to secede in 1933. But I think we can explain that by other factors as well. But I think on the whole, I think that the disadvantaged jurisdictions are in an invidious situation, and they're sort of they can't afford to complain. They certainly, what are they going to threaten to do? I don't know what instability they can actually induce in a federal system. They're generally speaking happy to get whatever they can and partly support centralization for those reasons as well, as we discussed earlier.
Okay. So basically your short answer would be stability in federations is most threatened by, the wealthier constituents.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Listen, I have a follow-up question on the question on public sector reform, and the attendee here says that what specifically meant here is the liberalization of public services, public-private partnerships, and so on. What were their implications for fiscal federalism there?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, these were internal matters for both at the Commonwealth level and at the state level. These were internal matters. I don't see it as I could be wrong, but I don't see it as having significant implications for fiscal federalism.
And did the states follow the Commonwealth here? Was there a kind of similar trajectory in
yes, I mean, like most countries, there was a broad movement, and it was picked up by all governments generally. The one big change that did interact with intergovernmental relations in Australia was in the mid-1990s, when the states were persuaded to engage in massive privatization or sales of their big utilities. And that cost them an enormous amount of revenue. And so it was a complex arrangement with the Commonwealth government whereby they would be paid compensation payments for the privatization of their utilities. And not least of all, because a privatized utility pays taxes to the Commonwealth government, whereas before it paid most of its revenue as dividends to the state governments. And with a whole structure of regulation around it, the National Competition Council, who supervised the implementation of these reforms and signed off on the reward payments. So that was the one moment when public sector reform intersected directly with intergovernmental relations. But other than that, I don't think so.
Okay, thank you.
And that's now well and truly behind us. That policy ran from 1995 to 2005. Called National Competition Policy.
If we go back to the GST sharing, I think you might have spoken to this, but I'll read you the question anyway. Do you have any views on whether it's preferable that federal provincial transfers should come out of federal general revenues versus sharing of specific taxes, such as the GST? You seem to be kind of inclined to go towards the GST, right?
I think there's a lot to be said for identifying specific taxes and assigning them more carefully and clearly to provide reliability, continuity, etc. And again, that's partly the Swiss model as well. So I think there's a lot to be said for that.
All right, thank you. I'll read you another one here. You mentioned asymmetry is important when there are divergent conceptions of VFI and the use of the federal spending power. Recent bilateral agreements on childcare in Canada is perhaps a good illustration of this. Is Canada an outlier in its use of bilateral agreements, which inherently carry some form of asymmetry? By contrast, are special purpose payments in Australia largely symmetrical per capita, or are they often asymmetrical and concluded bilaterally?
There's certainly no shortage of bilateral agreements, but they're not agreements that introduce a great deal of asymmetry, and they don't necessarily exist. They haven't arisen to address the needs of a highly asymmetrical federation. So I can't think of many. I mean, there's certainly some instances where, for instance, Western Australia has refused to participate in some sort of program for a while anyway. But generally, they're precisely because Australia is very different from Canada in this respect, you don't see that kind of asymmetry existing. So, for instance, perhaps the closest to a Canadian example would be a few years ago, a major public policy initiative was launched at the federal level in Australia called the National Disability Insurance System, NDIS. This meant the replacement of state-based disability services programs by an overarching national one run by the Commonwealth government. And this meant reconciling whatever each state had to the new system. Western Australia stood apart for a while, but in the end, we have one national program now. It's not, there's no Quebec. There's no jurisdiction that's going to insist on going its own way and somehow having a parallel system with compensation.
Okay, Alan. I have a few more here. Hang in there. Have you looked at the territorial formula financing in Canada? Right, we have outside of equalization, there's a specific formula for the three territories. Have you looked at that? Do other countries have similar programs for territories that are not constituent units, but that require transfers? Any thoughts on that?
There's only one thing I have to say about it, because I have not looked closely at territorial financing. I'm aware that it exists, but that's about all in the Canadian situation. But it did arise in my mind some years ago in the Australian context, where the two territories are treated like states for equalization. And so the common state revenue pool is shared with the two territories. Now, one of the territories, the Northern Territory, has a huge disadvantage. It's fiscally disadvantaged, has very few revenue sources, and it has massively greater spending needs. And those two factors enter into the equation about how much equalization you receive, mainly because it has no industry, it has a much larger Indigenous population than the rest of Australia, so it's much more expensive. And so a lot of state money goes to subsidize the Northern Territory, which isn't a state. In a sense, logically, you might say that should be the Commonwealth's job out of the Commonwealth's own budgetary resources. Why should state money be shared disproportionately with the territory? And so, there's something, in a sense, something odd about the Australian system, where there isn't a territorial financing arrangement in place that treats them differently because they are different. So that's my only comment on that one.
Then maybe that could raise the question of what would be the implications of bringing the three Canadian territories into the general equalization formula, right?
Exactly, and I don't know what those implicate. Yeah. And partly, of course, is coming back to my point about the difficulty of having a very large jurisdiction being a beneficiary. Presumably they're relatively small populations, like the Northern Territories is a very small population, is what makes it manageable. As long as they're not a large population jurisdiction, it's not necessarily a huge problem.
Right. Okay, I'm going to read another one here. Canada's bi-communalism aside, do you see the greater variation in size between Canadian provinces, Ontario, PEI, compared to Australia's states, New South Wales versus Tasmania, as having an impact on the political dynamics and administrative structures of fiscal relations in each country? So the fact that we have like greater population discrepancies between provinces than Australia does between its states, does that have an impact?
I don't think so. I think it's, as I said, its impact comes mainly when you have a disproportion between beneficiaries and contributors in an equalization system. If you have a relatively small population jurisdiction that is much wealthier and has to share thus a per capita enormous proportion of that wealth with the rest of the country, that becomes very difficult to maintain. So if Prince Edward Island was funding the rest of Canada, that might be tricky. And who knows, maybe they'll discover significant oil off the coast of PEI tomorrow. But if it doesn't affect those kind of fiscal relationships, then I don't see why it's an issue. I mean, it's an issue for other reasons, but not to do with fiscal federalism, I don't think. So. Okay,
thank you.
And it certainly makes those arrangements much simpler that in Australia, traditionally the two main recipients, Tasmania and South Australia, neither of them have a large population. So.
Thank you. I have one in French here, so I'm just going to translate it for you. You've talked about pressures and maybe some instability in relation to equalization in Canada. Do you think that these pressures are worse in Canada than elsewhere? Are you referring to the referendum in Alberta? And more generally, do you think that the Canadian system should be reformed, and how? Do you think perhaps it should take into account expenditure needs like in Australia?
It's interesting. This is the first time somebody's raised the question about expenditure needs, because as many of you will be aware, the Canadian system does not factor in expenditure needs. It only calculates the input side, that is the tax raising capacity of a jurisdiction. The Australia system does both, but the consequences of to some extent are cross-cutting. So in some jurisdictions, it increases factoring in their needs, their spending needs profile, increases their eligibility for as a recipient. In other cases, it cuts it back. So I don't think that's a significant factor necessarily. If it is, it's sort of it'll be a coincidence if it is. But it certainly strikes me that the Canadian case is quite distinctive in how challenging it is. Certainly in any of the ones I've looked at, the challenges of equalization are greater in Canada than anywhere else. To do with the factors I pointed to. And then you could add other elements to it, the difference between oil wealth and other forms of wealth and so on. Everything seems to work to make it worse in Canada than elsewhere. And I don't know. I mean, to me, there is no obvious solution to all of that at all.
And would you like adding needs assessment in Canadian equalization? Do you think that would be a good idea?
Well, I think in principle, since it is part of calculating how much of a challenge governments have, it's one thing to say how much revenue they have access to. But it may well be the case that they have highly differing needs for reasons that are outside of their control. So logically, it ought to be part of the equation. It's part of the equation in Switzerland. It's part of the equation in Australia. And so it would make sense to include it. Once you do, of course, the process becomes even more complicated. And then you really would need a Commonwealth Grants Commission to do all the hard work about calculating who gets what. And of course, once you get something like the Commonwealth Grants Commission, it tends to be a source of conflict and instability in itself, because it becomes this opaque, highly complicated process that no one feels they either can understand or are allowed to understand, this mysterious black box in which decisions are made and emerge. And the more variables that are brought into the calculation, the more that's likely. So there's a trade-off. But certainly logically, there's no reason why you wouldn't include the cost side as well as the revenue side. But those are much trickier to calculate, of course.
All right, thank you. So let's maybe I'll finish it off with getting you to speak to a point that you briefly mentioned earlier on, the more diverse political economy of Canada in relation to Australia, and how that impacts fiscal federalism. So maybe we can hear you a little bit on that to conclude out.
Well, what I was referring to there is in essence the fact that natural resources are much more evenly distributed in Australia than they are in Canada. So some of the key hydrocarbon resources, for instance, much more evenly distributed in Australia. Both New South Wales and Victoria, the two main metropolitan manufacturing states, have enormous reserves of coal, for instance. For a long time, all of Australia's domestic oil came from offshore Victoria again. So the resources were not just in states that relied entirely on resources or largely on resources, but distributed much more evenly around the country. And then, as I said about Australia's major resource products, they're largely exported, not consumed domestically. There was nothing like, no risk of anything like the National Energy Program in the 1980s occurring in Australia, because one part of the country was not selling these sort of resources to another part of the country. So things are rather easier in terms of that sort of political economy in Australia. Not to say that all states are hugely well supplied with natural resources. South Australia isn't particularly, which is why it's the world leader now in renewable electricity generation of wind and solar. But and we don't have a jurisdiction that is massively endowed with hydroelectricity resources like Quebec is. There is one jurisdiction, Tasmania, which has the same capacity that way, but it's, of course, a minor player in the scheme of things. So it's generally an easier political economy that way.
All right. Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you for your presentation and for answering all of these questions thoroughly. It was a pleasure to have you. It was a pleasure to have all the attendees also virtually present. Je veux simplement vous rappeler, avant de conclure, que les prochains conférenciers sous l'axe de recherche du fédéralisme du Centre d'études en gouvernance seront Félix Mathieu et Evelyne Brie. Ils parleront de leur nouveau livre, Un pays divisé, alors un peu lié à ce qu'on a discuté aujourd'hui. Donc, un pays divisé, identité, fédéralisme et régionalisme au Canada. Donc, les auteurs nous arrivent avec une analyse là, de données de sondage de la Confédération de demain, Confederation of Tomorrow. Et ils nous arrivent aussi, vous allez voir, avec des prescriptions ou des recommandations assez provocantes, assez fortes. Et donc, ça sera jeudi le 4 novembre à partir de midi. So, thank you very much to everybody. Thank you to Alan and for everybody else being here. Thank you to the Center on Governance administrators for the logistical and administrative work on this event. And we hope to see everybody for our next several events. Thank you very much and have a good day.